There is a phrase we use back in the country. It says, "Be without food, but don't be without shelter or home." Shelter is very important than food. I was working as much as you can work. Like 3 jobs. Even with all of those efforts, I couldn't afford to even get a little bit time with the kids.
At the age of 16, I entered the American foster care system. I've pulled myself out of some pretty bad spots, but I needed housing, and what I was making was just not cutting it at the time.
How can a family grow and prosper if they don't have a home that they can afford in a decent neighborhood?
In the past several years, the situation has become more urgent than we've seen even 10 years ago. It has implications for people's lives.
There are so many American families that don't have enough income to afford rental housing. Half of the renters in this country are paying more than 30% of their income for housing.
The low-income housing tax credit allows investors to invest money in housing and get credits, and the result is funds to build additional low-income housing.
The Section 8 vouchers are the primary way to help people afford housing.
Vouchers are a way for a resident to get into an apartment that costs more than what they can afford with their 30% of budget allocated to housing.
There definitely would have been a lot more detours, a lot more failures, a lot more uncertainty.
Now I know that I can enjoy the life, being with the kids, and have a brighter future.
First off, I think housing is a nonpartisan issue, but I certainly believe that the bipartisan approach to solving it is what needs to happen.
Every social goal that we want for the people of the United States revolve around housing. A precondition for making progress is to have a decent place to say, tonight I'm going home to rest.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Francis Torres, Director of Housing and Infrastructure here at the BPC's J. Ronald Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy. Thank you so much for joining us for today's event on homelessness, housing markets, and federal policy. As this audience knows, homelessness has become a pressing and highly salient policy challenge in recent years. The increasing number of people experiencing homelessness reflects a confluence of factors, from high housing costs and the design of public assistance programs to behavioral health conditions and the strain on local shelter systems. Over the past few years, our team has been conducting research, consulting subject matter experts, and engaging local leaders to better understand what drives homelessness, highlight best practices at the community level to address it, and examine what the federal government can do to prevent and ultimately end homelessness in the United States. Though we are primarily housers, focused on tackling issues of housing supply, preservation, and demand, our goal with this initiative is to have connective tissue and help build it between the worlds of housing policy analysis and homelessness services. Our view is that there's much to learn from each other in solving the problem of homelessness in America. So to ground our research in real-world conditions, we convened roundtables in 3 cities, Chattanooga, Seattle, and Salt Lake City. In a moment, I'll walk you through the key findings of our work, and you will also hear directly from leaders on the ground in each of these communities in a panel conversation moderated by my colleague, Laura Hausman. We're also lucky to have with pre-recorded remarks from Representative Suzanne Bonamici of Oregon, a key congressional champion on homelessness issues, in which she provides her view on the federal policy discussion around this issue. And then before I dive in, I just wanted to thank Ron Terwilliger, the Hilton Foundation, and the Melville Charitable Trusts, whose generous support made a lot of this research possible. And with that, I will turn to the presentation. So, to kick us off, our report is titled Homelessness, Housing Markets, and Federal Policy, Local Lessons and Policy Implications. You will be able to read it on our website, and I believe the link will also be shared with you in the chat here. And to kick us off, I wanted to just make sure we're all on the same page as to the trends. Homelessness, as many of you know, has experienced historic highs in recent years. What you're seeing here is HUD's point in time count from its annual homeless assessment report, which tracks estimates of homelessness every year. And it's the count of people experiencing homelessness on a given night in January of every year. The trend line tells a clear story. After several years of slow but steady progress in reducing homelessness, the numbers have climbed sharply in recent years. And this is not exclusively a regional phenomenon, it's a national pattern, and it demands, in our view, a national response. Drilling down into the numbers and to discuss the scale of the challenge, the most recent PID count numbers that we have showed upwards of 770,000 people experiencing homelessness in a given night, which was an 18% year over year increase from the year prior, the largest percent increase on record. We also saw an alarming number of people, over 150,000, were estimated to be experiencing chronic homelessness. So long-term homelessness combined with a disabling condition, which is of course very hard to address. However, among all the concerning news, there was something quite positive, a positive proof point. Veteran homelessness was down 55% since 2010. And this didn't happen by accident. It was a result in part and among other factors, but crucially, of key federal investments and bipartisan commitment to programs such as the HUD VA supportive housing vouchers and supportive services for veteran families. We think these programs are a model for what success can look like in reducing homelessness across the country. Now, as I said at the top, BPC is we have a storied track record in housing policy. We're housers. So why did we decide to focus on homelessness in this effort? Well, we saw four key reasons. First, homelessness is among the most salient and polarized policy issues right now in Washington, but federal debate around it is often disconnected from the realities that cities and service providers, folks at the local level, and folks across a lot of different issue area expertise and domains will know. So we thought it was just a fertile terrain for some research. Secondly, federal policy is rapidly shifting around this issue with key changes in administrative policy, key shifts in legislative proposals around this. So that creates uncertainty for local systems and households that depend on federal funding, but it also creates opportunity to think through new approaches that can help tackle this problem. Third, sort of follows from those last 2 points, there is a need for a trusted bipartisan voice grounded in evidence, which is, of course, what BPC has a long track record of being and doing. And fourth, the Terwilliger Center, as a key center in housing policy conversations here in Washington, identified a gap between housing policy analysis and homelessness research more broadly, and we decided to step in to fill that gap. So to those ends, we decided to get outside of the Beltway, go and talk to people in different parts of the country in roundtables, which we hosted in Chattanooga, Tennessee, Seattle, Washington, and Salt Lake City, Utah. We convened these roundtables to engage local officials, service providers, housing developers, community leaders, people with experience of homelessness. We wanted to ask what was working, what wasn't, and what could the federal government do differently. Our initial takeaways from these conversations really emphasize four key points across all three cities. Some of these might be perhaps more clear to some members of our audience, but still we thought it was important to hear the voices of people on the ground really emphasize these points. Firstly, of course, is the connection between housing and homelessness. Housing costs for low-income households are a central and direct driver of homelessness in the communities that we went to. So it's not simply a homelessness services problem, it's also deeply connected with housing supply and affordability. Secondly, prevention and programs and rehousing programs are oftentimes underfunded for the scale of need they face. There are good models that exist, there's great work happening to meet the needs of people that are in crisis and experiencing homelessness, but it can be quite challenging for local systems to scale as that need increases. Thirdly, visible homelessness and encampments and unsheltered public homelessness are very salient, and they're shaping both public perceptions and policy decisions at the local level, which of course addresses a problem that voters see, but also pulls resources away from other responses that might address longer-term solutions. And fourth, and this is a key one for us, local systems have really optimized to address the needs of people in crisis, but they're not necessarily well equipped to prevent homelessness in the first place. And there's a quote here from one of our roundtable attendees emphasizing that even though they've really built out the capacity to respond to crisis, they're not very good at stopping it before it starts. We think this is a key point for federal government and policy stakeholders to know. So to that point, we distilled 4 lessons for federal policymakers from this effort. And while these are not policy recommendations per se, we hope they can serve as a basis for future federal action, future bipartisan action on homelessness. The key lesson is about data. So even though the point in time count I showed earlier is a useful tool, it is really just a one-night snapshot taken in January. There are other data sources, such as HMIS, that track the inflow of people in and out of homelessness, but collecting and publishing that data takes a very long time, and it makes it a little bit less useful for tailoring responses in the short term. By contrast, by name list systems and other systems that track individuals near real time enable faster housing placement and smarter resource allocation. Lesson 2 is about the sustained commitment evidenced by programs that reduced veteran homelessness. Like I said at the top, we saw a 55% reduction in veteran homelessness since 2010. And this was largely due to these key programs, HUD, VASH, and SSVF, programs that not only established a collaboration across federal agencies, but maintained support across multiple administrations at the federal level, across both parties, administrations of both parties. And in fiscal year 2024 alone, nearly 48,000 veterans were housed, with a 96% one-year housing retention rate. So these gains are not just historical in the past, they're still happening, and they show that consistency and investment can work when it's well planned. Lesson 3 is about prevention. Intervening upstream before someone loses their housing is both more effective and more cost efficient than emergency response. It reduces homelessness and avoids costly downstream use of emergency rooms, jails, and other kinds of systems. And speaking of systems, our last point here is about systems thinking. Homelessness policy does not operate in a silo. Changing aspects of funds for homelessness providers can ripple through the broader affordable housing financing system and shape the supply of deeply affordable units for years to come. So policymakers need to understand the implications of their choices clearly and see these connections between homelessness and housing policy clearly. And then just to close out, I wanted to share this passage from our report, which reflects the spirit of what we're trying to do. We know there is broad bipartisan agreement that homelessness is a serious national problem and that the federal government has a meaningful role to play in addressing it. The disagreements lie not in whether to act, but in how. And although the path forward may not be easy, it will be well served by rigorous evaluation, an honest accounting of policy trade-offs, and a shared recognition that every person experiencing homelessness deserves access to a safe, stable, and affordable home. With that, I thank you for listening to my presentation, and I'd like to introduce the next part of our programming. We'll have Representative Suzanne Bonamici of Oregon provide pre-recorded remarks, and she's, of course, a member of Congress with a long track record of advocating for solutions to homelessness and the broader housing affordability crisis. And she is, of course, the co-chair of the Congressional Caucus on Homelessness. So while the Congresswoman could not join us in person today, we are very thankful for her pre-prepared remarks, which you'll hear from now, and those will be followed by our moderated panel conversation on local lessons and policy implications from our research effort. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I want to start by thanking Dennis and the Bipartisan Policy Center. I'm Suzanne Bonamici, and I'm honored to represent Northwest Oregon. I'm also one of the co-chairs of the Congressional Caucus on Homelessness. I regret that I'm not able to join you in person, but I send best wishes for a meaningful event today. Too many families in Oregon and across the country are struggling with high costs for everything: housing, groceries, childcare, healthcare. It's unacceptable that we live in a wealthy nation, yet affordable housing is out of reach for millions of people, and too many people are unhoused entirely. The president promised to improve affordability for working families, but many of the policies and budgets he's proposing will make it harder for people to stay housed or to find housing. In fact, the budget this administration is trying to pass would put into law harmful approaches to homelessness and reduce or eliminate funding for programs that support people who would benefit from the assistance. For example, this is the second year that the president's budget proposes to completely eliminate the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. This council leads the strategic plan to prevent and end homelessness, and since 2010, when the first plan was launched, they've seen success in taking thousands of individuals off the street. And the president's budget also eliminates the Continuum of Care program, the government's primary funding stream to address homelessness. The Continuum of Care program has had strong bipartisan support since Congress authorized it and made it permanent more than 15 years ago. This administration is also working to put into law harmless approaches to homelessness that seek to criminalize people who are unhoused. All of these actions are happening at a time when homelessness is at an all-time high. In 2024, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, reported a 39% increase in families staying in homeless shelters or visibly on the streets. And too many students and veterans are experiencing homelessness and housing instability. The increase in homelessness is driven in large part by the nation's affordability crisis in each community. Urban, suburban, and rural, they all have unique needs, but every community is wrestling with the lack of affordable housing. And the affordable housing crisis didn't start overnight. We've seen years of underinvestment and inaction. House prices are at historic highs and the cost of housing has increased, but wages have not kept pace. And I hear more frequently from constituents and advocates that their parents own houses, but they don't know if they will ever own a home themselves. They are priced out of the market. Everyone understands the need to address housing and homelessness, but can't agree on how we achieve that. And it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. Older Americans experience homelessness differently from young people and differently from how veterans or families experience homelessness. But they all need housing and community development options that meet their unique needs. Last year, I had the pleasure of watching the documentary No Place to Grow Old. It was incredibly moving. The stories are really poignant. I'm a former consumer protection lawyer, and there was one story about how a bank's predatory loans changed the trajectory of someone's life. Housing and economic stability, it's heartbreaking, and it got me fired up. Policymakers need to know there is a human cost to their actions and decisions, and that's not always evident. In Congress, we are fighting for the federal resources we need to shore up affordable housing supply and to implement programs that support people in unstable housing. It's the complex nature of the housing crisis that calls for innovative approaches to help people who need it achieve stable housing and meet their needs. I started my legal career at Legal Aid, and I learned that people do not struggle by choice, and I'm leading multiple bills to address the housing crisis. My Build Housing with Care Act, my Project Turnkey Bill, Start Housing and the Runaway and Homeless Youth and Trafficking Prevention, and Price, which deals with manufactured homes. Other successful housing programs like the HUD VA Veterans Affairs Supportive Housing Program, these combine housing choice vouchers with case management and clinical services. There's a proven track record of achieving reductions in veteran homelessness while maintaining bipartisan support. Housing is essential for people to find stability and reach a brighter future, and it is a good investment for individuals and for families. I'm looking forward to continuing the fight with you, continuing that fight until everyone has a safe place to call home. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman, for those remarks, and thank you to everyone for joining us here today. As we've heard, there are real differences in how each party approaches funding for homelessness programs, but learning from local practices that have achieved marked reductions in homelessness can engender areas of true bipartisan consensus and offer valuable insights for federal policymakers. To expand on this discussion, I'm excited to introduce an esteemed panel. Our first panelist is Stephen Howell, the Director of Operations at the Chattanooga Regional Homeless Coalition, where he drives system coordination, data-informed planning, and partnerships with local governments, service providers, and community organizations across the region. Our next panelist is Sarah Dickmeyer. Sarah is the External Affairs Manager for Plymouth Housing, which has been providing permanent supportive housing in King County for the last 45 years. Our third panelist is Wayne Niederhauser, who most recently served as the Utah State Homeless Coordinator, securing funding for deeply affordable housing while pioneering innovative interventions such as microshelters. Wayne previously served as president of the Utah State Senate. Last but certainly not least, we have Salim Firth, Senior Research Fellow and Director of the Urbanity Project at the Mercatus Center. Salim researches and advises local governments on housing production and land use regulation. Thank you all for being here, and let's dive right in and talk about what contributes to homelessness and what addressing homelessness looks like on the ground. So let's start with you, Stephen. Chattanooga has achieved measurable reductions in homelessness during a period when much of the country was moving in the opposite direction. What made that possible, and what lessons can you share with federal policymakers?
Absolutely, Laura. First of all, thank you for having me. I'm happy to share about Chattanooga's success. I think first and foremost, something that we were able to do as a region in the last few years is really invest in system infrastructure and not just individual housing programs. Obviously, the folks who are working at our partner agencies, working alongside folks experiencing homelessness, are doing incredible work. But we were able to really maximize that impact once we were able to bring folks together in a coordinated way and get them really working as a system. And so in that year span, we went from many silos, a lot of agencies sort of operating on their own, to a true region-wide coordinated entry assessment, a daily updated by name list, 4 to 5 case conferencing groups meeting weekly or biweekly, and our assessment tool being used by roughly 5 agencies to around 40. So the explosion in system utilization really made a pathway forward for that. And that came primarily as a result of local government investment in system infrastructure, particularly in our partnership with the city of Chattanooga. Through the COC grant, historically, our coordinated entry funding has been around $40,000 total, which is hardly enough to pay someone's salary, let alone support a whole system. And so we're very grateful for the local investment that took place so that we were able to build out a system that works, that brought people together, and that really allowed us to make targeted improvements and targeted reductions in homelessness for the subpopulations that our region has. So,
remarkable progress. And if you were to be approached by a locality who wanted to get to a by name list but was starting totally from scratch, where would you tell them to start?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think every community is going on this journey. I think in the last few years, it feels like at every conference, there's at least one session that's about a new assessment tool that someone has developed. And I'm always really excited to see that because I think those of us who have been in this world for a long time are familiar with old assessment tools that just don't necessarily work well for the needs of getting people into housing quickly and prioritizing them effectively and equitably. And so I think it is extremely important for system leaders in each COC to really make a coordinated effort to sit down with providers in the region to learn from best practices, either nationally or regionally from other communities, but to develop an assessment and a coordinated entry assessment in particular that really works for their community. It's something that not only prioritizes people equitably according to the folks that are living in their region, but also serves as a tool to speed up that matching process that has to happen to figure out what sort of programs might be right for someone. We know, and I know that we'll talk about more, that there's no one solution to the problem that we're describing. And so the ability to identify early on what sorts of programs someone might benefit from and cut down on their time spent unhoused, not only increases the efficiency of the system, but more importantly, decreases the extended amount of trauma that person experiences the longer they're unhoused. And so I think in our process, it took a lot of focus grouping. It took piloting a couple different tools and just iteration after iteration of getting to a place where our partners felt like the tool that we had developed worked for them, but also as system leaders worked for us and gave us the information we needed to really coordinate everyone around making market reductions in homelessness. So.
And a perfect segue to Sarah. In the last couple of years, King County has seen more people get housed while overall homelessness keeps rising. So how do you explain this tension, and what does it tell us about effective solutions to prevent and also address homelessness?
Yeah, so I work for Plymouth Housing, which, as you said, has been around for 45 years. We were founded by a group of church volunteers who saw people sleeping outside and wanted to do something about it. And I think it's worth saying that much hasn't changed, which is that we have homelessness and we also have community desire to do something about it. So we provide supportive housing, which is long-term rent-controlled housing for people with complex conditions coming out of homelessness, often chronic homelessness, with on-site and off-site supportive services. It is incredibly effective at ending homelessness at the individual level. And by that, I mean approximately 90 to 95% of people who move into supportive housing do not return to homelessness. And that's true across providers across the country year after year. It is a very effective intervention in the chronic homelessness cycle, but it doesn't do anything to prevent people from falling into homelessness for the first time. And as we've seen, housing costs rise nationwide, but more dramatically in some places like Seattle, Washington, while average incomes have gone up at a much slower pace, particularly for broad sections of the population. We're seeing more and more people live and get by on razor-thin margins, where they are one paycheck or life experience away from housing instability. In Seattle, where we've had tremendous economic growth, I heard a statistic recently that for every 2 jobs we've created 1 new housing unit. And that is the basic math. You've got, in a lot of places, an infusion of people or an infusion of high earners that puts pressure on existing housing stock and overall cost of living for lower income households. And when you look at the population that we serve, which is disproportionately older, the fastest growing population of people falling into homelessness are seniors. More than half of our residents at Plymouth are over 50, which for people who have experienced long-term homelessness can seem much older due to the physical traumas and experiences of living unhoused for an extended period of time. And these folks also have multiple disabling conditions. The average income of our residents is less than $10,000 a year. What housing options exist in our city or in your city, depending on where you're calling in from, when a 1-bedroom in Seattle costs $2,000 a month? Or to put it maybe another way, and I'll finish with the rhetorical question, no matter where you may be calling in from, I think we've all heard some version of a statistic about our community that says a minimum wage worker would need to work X number of hours a week to afford a studio apartment. Sometimes those numbers are absurd, like 80 hours a week to afford a studio apartment or 120 hours a week to afford a studio apartment. How do we think that actually works out in practice?
Very, very well put. And I want to kind of expand on this concept of the path to preventing homelessness, because it's a lot more expensive to bring someone out than to prevent them from falling in. And turn to Salim. You've found that the availability of empty bedrooms actually plays a role in explaining homelessness trends across markets. Can you walk us through this insight and explain maybe its implications for efforts to reduce homelessness and the role that affordable housing supply has to play?
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to be here. Thank you so much. So I got into this space because I was so frustrated with the book Homelessness is a Housing Problem, which showed very convincingly that rates of homelessness are determined or influenced mostly by regional housing costs, not by, the regional incidence of mental illness or something like that. But it didn't explain why. And if you look, I mean, Sarah talked about the population that her organization serves, and that's true broadly across the US homeless population. They have extremely low incomes, so that even in a very low cost city, someone who's homeless is unlikely to be able to afford a studio apartment paying on their own with a stable monthly income, unless they have a voucher. So why do we have so much that difference in homelessness based on housing costs if everyone is kind of way below that margin of being able to pay for themselves anyway? And I think that the reason is that most people who are extremely poor are receiving assistance usually informally through networks of family and friends. And they're either, getting together with a bunch of roommates, they are staying actually very frequently with their parents up until the age at which their parents are likely deceased. You see a large number of single, extremely low income Americans living with their own parents and sometimes other family members. And so that's where the empty bedrooms comes in, because in more expensive cities, someone who's working class can afford kind of just enough housing for themselves, and they are maybe a little bit squeezed in on their own. They're doing okay for themselves, but if they have an adult child or sibling who is really struggling, they don't have space to help that person for a long period of time. And I think my contribution here was the very novel concept that like a house guest runs out of patience quicker on the couch than if he has his own bedroom. And I think that's, kind of secretly, we don't see these folks, right? They're not showing up for services. Not saying everything in their life is perfect. They've still got whatever issues they have. Sharing a house is not a perfect situation, but they are in a much better situation with family if that family has the resources to help them than if the family's like, hey, I'm sorry, you've been here 2 weeks on the couch. We can't take you any longer. You've got to go down and find services or sleep in a tent or something like that. And that's, unfortunately what we see with even people who have some income and some possibility of contributing to household expenses in the most expensive cities.
Thank you. And I think we've been highlighting the kind of the diversity of ways in which individuals and families fall into, experience, and eventually exit homelessness. So I'd love to turn to Wayne. You've worked on homelessness from two pretty different vantage points. As Senate president, you shepherded policy through the state legislature. And as Utah's homeless coordinator, you focused on the operational side. So I'm curious what those two experiences have been like and whether your understanding of the diversity of what homelessness encompasses has changed throughout.
Thanks, Laura. Everybody needs to understand that policymakers don't have time to dig deep into issues. Having been a policymaker and a leader of policymakers, the Utah session every year, legislative session, is 45 days. Most states are about 90 days, and there's a few states that have full-time legislatures, but they still don't have time to dig deep into every issue. And so we need to understand that it takes time to really understand the issues that face homelessness. When I was first put in this position in April of 2021, I spent 3 to 6 months digging deep into homelessness, My wife and I started doing outreach every Friday night. We still do that, even though I'm not in that position anymore. But we go out and help people who are unhoused, unsheltered in our community, help get them in a position where they can get back into housing, deal with the addictions that they have, the trauma that they have. And it takes that kind of understanding to really start to develop programs and to lead an effort to reduce homelessness in any situation. And so that was my effort, at least when I first started in that position. And having been a real estate developer, I'm a CPA also, but housing was such an important issue. And in my statewide tour of homelessness, and when I first got into my position, the number one issue was housing. And so we focused on that and were able to get some funding through the legislature. So having been a policymaker, understanding that system, we were very successful in getting money for one-time capital stack development. And we created the first state-based voucher system, which we called attainable housing grants, and developed 1,500 deeply affordable housing units, which had really never happened in the state either.
That's really valuable. I'm curious what I'd love to open it up to the whole panel and kind of ask about your thoughts on what has been your experience conveying the intricacies of this to policymakers. And have you seen any of their positions or understandings change, let's say, once they realize that there's a difference between chronic homelessness and single episode homelessness, for example? Stephen, you want to take a first stab, maybe?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think something that has been invaluable to those conversations for us locally has been with the data that we've been able to collect as a result of building out that system infrastructure. We can talk really for the first time very specifically for our region, how many people in a given situation or with given needs are experiencing homelessness. So whether that's how many families are actively experiencing homelessness at a given time, or veterans, or youth, or whatever the criteria might be. So instead of going to local governments or policy folks and saying, sort of in this abstract sense, we need to tackle homelessness as an issue, really making it more bite-size and saying, yes, while that is still true, but in this forum, whatever it may be, we're going to talk about specifically family homelessness and talk about how we can make gains in that area. And I think that relieves, or has relieved, some of the pressure that it, for especially our local folks, that it doesn't all have to be solved by one person at one time, that everyone can sort of specialize in their own way and contribute to overall success by targeting certain subpopulations. And so we've seen that work out with our school systems in particular, both our city and county government contributing to funding for families with children enrolled in our schools. We've seen that with youth programs coming online. We've seen that even moving into the prevention space. And so being able to talk very specifically about subpopulations in a real-time way has been invaluable to those efforts.
Absolutely. Sarah, I'd also love your thoughts, given, permanent supportive housing serves a specific population very well. And when it is attempted to be used as a one-size-fits-all solution, sometimes we can run into issues. So tell us a little bit about how you explain what permanent supportive housing is and who it's for.
That's a great question. I think permanent supportive housing is a a focus of attention right now, as is homelessness. And so it's really easy for permanent supportive housing to seem like the only solution to homelessness, when it isn't. It is, there's some variety in how different providers deliver permanent supportive housing. The fundamentals are pretty much the same, which is it is long-term with no limit on length of stay. It is permanently affordable, and it has staff dedicated to either serving residents with services directly on site or connecting residents to services off-site. People tend to understand that model. And for the population, what we try and do is we use the data that we have from operating as long as we have to describe here is a picture of the people that we serve. But we also try and create opportunities for our residents to tell their own stories. And we do that through an ethical storytelling process. Our communications team has a lot of ethical parameters to ensure that resident stories are shared with their full consent, and that we are, as a provider, very mindful about how we do that. But we also have residents who just on their own go out and tell their own stories. There was one city council meeting at the beginning of the year. We had 2 of our residents go to city council. There was some public conversation in that city about permanent supportive housing and about our building. Entirely their own idea. They went to public comment and they shared their experience both living in the building, a bit about their personal history, and how they felt about the community conversation that was happening. And it's stuff like that that does the best, I think, to educate policymakers on these are real people. The issue of othering that I think is very has always been present in conversations about homelessness. What do we do about homeless people, or what do we do about the homelessness issue? We're talking about constituents of cities and communities that yes, have higher needs because maybe they're experiencing housing insecurity, or maybe they're experiencing health challenges. But so are so many other people in community. The thing that has really kind of been the ultimate bridge, I think, in how we build relationships with policymakers and educate them on the work, is reminding them that, our residents are their constituents the same as people in market rate housing. And that has, I think, generated more buy-in and thoughtfulness and empathy that I think is really critical when you are a policymaker working on an issue that affects a population that has experienced a great deal of unmet need.
Absolutely. And let's connect these dots a little bit more between housing and homelessness. Salim, you wrote, and I'll paraphrase, but trying to solve homelessness without addressing the housing market is like trying to towel your floor dry in a thunderstorm when the roof of your home has blown off. So tell us a little bit more about what building some of the upstream drivers like affordable housing would look like.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to note, it's not just about deed-restricted affordable housing. This is about the broad-based market level of affordability. If we look at rates of homelessness, Mississippi and Alabama have some of the lowest rates in the US. And that's not because they've, have a fantastic record of providing a lot of affordable housing. It's because market rate housing is extremely cheap. And people can either, if they are stably employed, even at a very low wage, they can afford somewhere to live. Or if they're unstably employed, they usually can find a place that someone who cares about them will let them stay. And so that's how people avoid homelessness, is primarily through market housing. And I think that's been a big piece that's missing, is that Americans are wonderful in many ways, right? People take care of each other, they take care of their kin, and they do this through someone participating in the market and then maybe doing an off-market transaction where it's, you get to live in the room over the garage in exchange for doing some chores or something like that. And that's how people who have, mental illness, drug addiction, extremely low incomes, the same risk factors that exist in every city in the US, if you're in a place with affordable market rate housing, you're able to stay stably housed. And look, we know that the solution to broad-based market affordability, not just a small number of targeted units, that is only going to arrive in a high demand place by building a lot more housing. And the reality is we have a 50 plus year history of the elite coastal cities in the US having great jobs and not building enough housing. Like Sarah said about Seattle, one new home for every 2 jobs, that's not going to cut it. And so you're getting bidding wars over the existing homes. And it's not a coincidence that in the cities where millionaires have to pay the most for housing, you have the most people living in tents. And so we need to have a serious conversation about what do these local zoning rules that keep our communities looking, very cute and nice in 1950s, what are those meaning way down the income spectrum for those who are most vulnerable? And I think we know the answer to that.
Absolutely. And I love the return to kind of a macro perspective. So I'll open this one up to the whole panel. A recurring challenge that we see is that the costs of homelessness will fall somewhere, regardless of what policy approach we use to address it. If you reduce one type of spending, the cost tends to show up somewhere else, inevitably. So how do you see that phenomenon manifest in your work, but also how do you explain these trade-offs to stakeholders and legislators who, as Wayne alluded to, might not have time to develop a comprehensive understanding?
Well, Laura, I think that one of the approaches I first took in when I was in this position as the homeless coordinator, I admit I didn't understand, and it took some time to get understanding and get legislators to come out and do outreach with you, to visit a micro shelter, permanent supportive housing. Those are really important issues. But having been a housing developer for many years, I've done dozens of pro formas on housing. And the reason why we don't have the deeply affordable housing that we need in this country, in Utah and other states, it doesn't pencil. For a developer, it will never attract capital. And then the supply and demand issues have been articulated already. But we're going to need housing tax credits. We need one-time funds to build capital stacks. You need rent support through vouchers or through some state program that we developed. If you don't build these and have these, we'll never have the deeply affordable housing that we need in this country and in our cities across the country. So, that's one thing that I focused on because of my housing background, to try and meet that number one problem that we're facing, and that scarcity of housing and the cost of housing. You're going to have to have subsidies. You're going to have help to make that housing happen.
And you mentioned the concept of, subsidy and funding certainty. I'd like to take a spin on that and ask Sarah about operating under uncertainty, including funding uncertainty. So over Plymouth's 45-year lifespan, it has navigated funding shifts, policy changes, political headwinds. And I'd say one recent example is the fiscal year 2025 COC competition notice of funding opportunity, which is, of course, subject to ongoing litigation and has been subject to federal court injunction since December. So that has left providers operating with little certainty about their funding future. So I'd love to ask, how that uncertainty affects your work.
Yeah. And I would say it's not just providers operating under uncertainty, it's state and local governments operating under uncertainty as well.
Thank you.
It has really made clear that core pieces of the work that a lot of us on this meeting do, which is education and relationship building, those things are incredibly critical. It is important that not only policymakers, but the public know what supportive housing is, what the continuum of care is, what is COC, what is NOFO, what is NOFA, what is HUD, what is HUD-VASH, and all of these things, but also educating about how braided and leveraged our community health infrastructure really is. Disruptions to one significant funding source, particularly one like the COC that has historically been quite stable, it ripples throughout the entire system. Not just within an organization where, they manage funding from different sources, or maybe they more heavily rely on COC funding versus other funding. But state and local governments make funding and budgeting decisions all the time about how can they maximize their limited resources with the resources that they receive from the federal government or are supplemented by the federal government to achieve their policy goals. And that disruption, you take one leg of a table, the whole table is going to get really wobbly. That also has really emphasized the importance of relationships and communication. So part of that is the ability to do that educating work. But one thing that was really exciting and warming to see in Washington state was the importance of state and local leaders communicating with each other. In Seattle, and then King County, which Seattle is a part of, and then Washington state. That fiscal year 2025 NOFO came out in November. In Seattle and King County, they do their budgeting in the fall. The state legislature does their budgeting in the beginning of the year, starting in January. And Seattle and King County committed midway through their budget process, not even a couple weeks, I think, before they adopted their final budgets for the next biennium, to set aside some funds for backfill just in case what seemed like a major disruption or even defunding of the federal continuum of care dollars that come to our region, if that came to pass. And then our state legislature did the same thing when they convened. And so being able to for those governments to be able to communicate with each other about the role that different funding sources play in the overall system and the importance of keeping the system stable is really, really critical. And providers have a key role to play there. And then just as a provider, navigating the unpredictability has certainly been a challenge. Our organization has been intentionally working on funding diversification for several years, which today we are particularly grateful for. But at the end of the day, there is no way for local communities or individual providers to fully backfill what federal funding may and appear to be at risk, but more importantly, to meaningfully address the crisis without robust federal support. There never has been a time when state, local, and individual organizations can resolve community-wide housing stability challenges without federal support, and there certainly isn't now.
You mentioned this broader connection. Wayne or Salim, I would love your thoughts on this. The concept that abrupt changes in COC funding can actually affect affordable housing developments, for example, LIHTC finance developments, because there are certain covenants, affordability requirements that a lot of developers lean on COC funds to be able to support. So tell us a little bit more about what you've learned about the connection between affordable housing financing, those LIHTC units that you mentioned, Wayne, and the role of the COC dollars.
Well, there's been a big shift. Sorry, Salim, but big shift in the direction of that funding. It's critical funding. COC funding does administration on a local level, and coordination is big. Being able to coordinate homelessness from housing to support. We talk a lot about housing here, but the support for housing is very, very critical. And Utah did a lot of this housing first about a decade ago, but kind of had some failures with that because with a chronic population, you also have to have the support there for that housing to work. And housing support go together, and the COC funding helps that coordination, but also a big chunk of that went to like housing authorities and so forth to help these capital stacks making housing happen. And so policymakers, and I admit I've been one of those and have been the problem, is that you think that just a quick change in policy, everybody's going to be able to adapt quickly. That doesn't happen. And having consistency in policy is a key issue for those who provide and those who administrate different programs, homelessness, or whatever it is.
Salim, do you have any thoughts you want?
Yeah, I'll just add. So I'm not at all an expert in affordable housing finance. Cities have to control what they can, right? There's always going to be aspects of policy or the macroeconomy that are outside of your control. We've been through COVID. Those of us who are a little older have been through the great financial crisis. Those are massive shocks. You can't control those. Right now, there's policy uncertainty as well. One of the things that's part of why I talk so much about local regulation, because that's the non-budget tool that local governments have, right? So if your rules, your local rules, make it illegal for someone to rent out a room in their house, or make it difficult, right? Maybe they have to go through a big registry. That's a problem. You can fix that problem and let somebody who has a minimum wage job get a roof over their heads legally and then have tenant protections because they're now legal instead of probably just doing this anyway illegally. If you block the construction of accessory dwelling units, change that. Those are the things that are within your control. And then obviously you can advocate and you want to coordinate, you want to, as Wayne said, make policy predictable. But in an uncertain environment, look at the entire population of people who might be at risk of homelessness. It's much larger than the people who are experiencing homelessness at any one moment. And think about that huge population of low-income people as your constituency and say, hey, these folks have a lot of resources. I'm going to help them use their own resources to meet their needs so that they don't become a much bigger problem for themselves and the community. And I think going right back to what Francis said at the very beginning, it's so much cheaper and easier to help someone stay out of homelessness than to help them out of it once they've experienced it for a long time.
Absolutely. And I think, there's a lot of promising and heartening examples to look to of cities and localities that are pioneering these approaches to encourage thoughtful development of greater density, whether it's Houston, whether it's Columbia, whether it's San Diego. Each city seems to be trying to be a laboratory of not democracy and innovative housing development. So kind of stepping back from that, unfortunately, we only have time for one last question, but I want to direct it to the full panel. There's broad agreement that homelessness is a problem and that the federal government has some role to play. And of course, the devil's in the details. Disagreements are about how to solve this problem and what that role looks like. But today's conversation has shown some common ground for policymakers across the aisle. So I'd love to just ask the whole panelist, the whole panel. What are your thoughts on, if you had two diametrically opposed policymakers in the room and you could say, I bet you agree on this one thing, this one concept, what would you tell them?
We need more housing. And we need to make it easier and less expensive to build housing.
And I think the 21st Century Road to Housing Act and the magnitude of its bipartisan support probably shows that those diametrically opposed lawmakers would agree with you when you say that.
Yeah, and it is housing. When I did my statewide tour back in 2021, number one issue was housing, the scarcity of housing. We want an abundance, like Klein and Thompson talked about in their book. And a lot of the issues there, what we face, and not just having capital stacks and all of that, getting a housing approval is a nightmare in this country. People do not want to, they come out with pitchforks and lanterns to stop deeply affordable housing from coming into their community.
Cut that red tape.
This
So
is extremely, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
This is extremely wonkish, but I would say, hey, we have a big program in LIHTC, but we also know from research that a lot of those dollars are lost along the way paying for consultants and lawyers and accountants. And how can we streamline the financing process of LIHTC so more of those dollars go to the express purpose of the program?
Absolutely. Well, very crestfallen to have to wrap it up here, but I want to thank our panel for what I think was a pretty optimism-inspiring discussion, if you ask me. And one final note before we close is that our annual Summit on Housing Supply Solutions will take place on June 23rd in Washington, D.C.'s Union Station. A link to registration should be shared soon and is also available on our website. I want to thank the panel. I want to thank the team and Representative Bonamici and everyone here listening today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.